Okay, so good afternoon everyone, prynawn da pawb. Croeso, welcome. Diolch am dod am y heddiw. Thank you for coming today to the USW's LGBT plus research panel, where we will be discussing drag, boxing, law, dance and science. Before we go any further, I'd just like to go through some house rules with you all, just to let you know. This session is being recorded. So if you'd like to put yourselves on mute and also turn your cameras off. We'd also ask you as well, if you feel comfortable, to pop your pronouns on your names. There will be an opportunity later to ask questions, and we just want to make sure that when referring to people, we're using their correct pronouns. On that, this is a place of love and understanding today. So any queerphobic actions, language or behaviour will result in instant removal from the event. But like I said, this is a place of love and understanding, and I'm sure we're not going to come across any of that today. I quickly mentioned, but I'll go into it in a little bit more detail. The chat function, it will be off during segments, but there will be an opportunity after each presentation for people to ask some questions and receive some answers. As for the event itself, I don't think I've probably introduced myself. My name is Devin Harris. To those of you that don't know, yes, my name is Devin Harris. My pronouns are he, they. I am a Sagittarius. And I am so very humbled and overjoyed actually to be here on behalf of LGBTQYMRU with University of South Wales. So thank you for having me. Some of the people that you can expect to hear from today, as you'll have seen on our Eventbrite information, is Gareth Powell from the House of Deviant. We have Dr. Ruth Gaffney-Rhys, who will be talking to us today about civil partnership, sexuality and the law. We have Dr. Sarah Cruz, who will be talking about boxing and performance, and swiftly followed by then Dr. Stuart Ayres, who will be talking about LGBTQ+ and STEM. Then followed by the lovely Dr. Tanya Akron, who will be discussing under the skin, dance movement therapy with LGBTQ+ people, before I then take up some more air to talk to you about LGBTQYMRU. But without much further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Tanya now, and I hope you enjoy.
Hi. Thank you so much, Bleddyn. It's just a pleasure to be co-hosting this with you, and we are going to be also holding some of the Q&As in between. Just wanted to thank a couple of people, because this is a collaborative event between, obviously, LGBTQYMRU, who's decided to host us, and they're launching their magazine. So we're going to be hearing about that, which is very exciting. And also, this is part of Spectrum, which is the USW LGBTQ+ staff network. So really wonderful, supportive staff that create different events throughout the year. And this is featuring LGBT History Month, which is amazing. And also we've had additional support for this event from USW Learning Services and also the Faculty of Creative Industries Research Department. So all these people have been putting their heads together to come up with this amazing lineup. And I'm just so thankful to all the speakers who've decided to give a bit of their time today. So it'll be a TEDx style. So, right, we're going to do 10 minutes and then hopefully 5 minutes in questions in between. And then at the end, if we have a little bit of time, we can discuss some new directions or ideas you might have, and just open it up for a more general discussion if we don't run out of time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bleddyn.
You know, I can't echo the sentiments enough that this is a place of celebration, obviously LGBT History Month, and all the amazing work that's gone into it. So our first speaker, I'm very pleased to announce, is Gareth Powell. Gareth is a seasoned cabaret performer specialising in drag performance and circus. My limbs are hurting just thinking of that. And soon to be graduate from USW with an MA in drama. They're also the co-founder of Sparklets, Flamingo, and the House of Deviants. Gareth has performed at cabarets, events, and festivals, and digital Zoom rooms, so you're in for a treat, across the UK for many years under his stage name, Ernie Sparkles. So without much further ado, Gareth.
Oh, hello. Hi, thank you. Thanks, Bleddyn. Thanks, Tanya. Hello, everyone. Hi, there we go. So I'm going to present what was formerly the my final project of my MA, which was this fabulous inclusive project about exploring the two worlds of drag performance and adults with a learning disability. 10 minutes really isn't much time to talk about it, so forgive me if I skip through quite a lot of the details, but I wanted to give you a kind of overview of what was happening. The exciting thing is the project is continuing and will grow over the next few months, which I'll talk about in a bit. So yeah, okay. So really, I was exploring what happens when two worlds collide. So I have my world as a cabaret performer, professional events host, theatre maker, circus performer, burlesque, all of it, burlesque performer. So my world is nightclubs and theatres and circus and sparkles and glitter and unicorns and hula hoops and fabulousness and privilege. And the other world I was looking at is something that's really close to my heart and I've been working with for nearly 20 years, adults with learning disabilities who often experience isolation and low self-esteem, lack of access, lack of motivation and stigma. Annoyingly, most of these things are caused by society and this medical model of discrimination that looks at what's wrong with people. And I wanted to create a project that flipped that round and looked more from the social model of disability, where we look at what people can do, what's blocking them from achieving. Leah Jones, who's an academic with Down syndrome, in one of her articles, she shares her story, attributing her experiences of depression and low self-esteem to the professionals that are working around her. So that the team that are working with her to support her often had a negative view on her life and her life choices, and that's hugely problematic. So I wanted to look more at the social model of disability and what we could do within the arts world to sort of empower and work with people to explore what they wanted to explore. There's an interesting quote from a Scope video on YouTube that talks about the social model, and it says, interestingly, if we ever came where all the barriers went, if we removed the barriers, then we wouldn't have disabled people, we would have just people with impairments. So the project came out of 2 years ago, Drag Syndrome. If you haven't heard of them, they're an incredible troupe of drag queens with Down syndrome based in London, but took over the world by storm in 2019. They went from a small nightclub one-nighter to literally traveling every country of the world over the course of a year. And I was really lucky enough to perform with them and host one of their events with Mencap Cymru's Learning Disability Disability Week in 2019 at the Tram Shed. And quite a few, it was a massively inclusive event. And there was a lot of people from various charity groups and supported housing across Wales came to watch it. And they were hugely inspired by these drag performers being on stage and doing their thing. And for me, it was possibly the most magical evening of my life. I'd never been to anywhere that was so accessible and so inclusive. And that really hit me as this is magic, real magic, and exactly how the world should be. So these people were inspired to become drag queens, and through the course of some volunteer work that I do with Learning Disability Wales's Gig Buddies project, I got to know quite a few adults with learning disabilities over the past couple of years, working with them online, working with them before the lockdown happened. And it wasn't long before they started asking questions about drag performance. So I wanted to create a project with them collaboratively that looked at drag performance and learning disability. This was like an accumulation of, like I said, 20 years experience for myself, as working as a professional support worker, volunteer, teaching, drag performance, reflective practitioner, all these things, inclusion, all these things that I've been working on over the past 20 years, all coming together into one project. So what was really important to me was that this project was collaborative the whole way through, and it wasn't just me teaching or me telling people how to be drag queens, because there is no answer to how to be a drag queen. It's such an individualized thing, and B, why should I teach that? Explore it yourself, explore it. And I wanted to provide that space where people could explore what drag performance is, and kind of provide a structure or a framework on which to have those explorations. So what we did was created like RuPaul's Drag Race, only way more fabulous and inclusive. So we created a project, and annoyingly, it was all meant to be live last summer, but because of COVID, we had to flip the project round and go digital. So we worked on Zoom and on Facebook to create this project. Okay, so this slide now is just like a kind of brief, like whiz through what we did and how we did it. You've probably seen these sort of arrow things before, where but the whole process with inclusive arts research is meant to be that we do it collaboratively. Fox and McPherson state that inclusive arts research should be creative collaborations between learning disabled and non-learning disabled artists, and a mutually beneficial two-way exchange. So the power dynamic is as equal as we can try and get it, really, where we're learning and exploring with each other. So it's a project with and not for. And they explain in their research that inclusive arts practice can be a hugely transformative force, which kind of reflected what we found in this project. Even though it was only a 4-week project, we found that there's huge potential for quite larger implications, which is what we're exploring next. So we did it all together. Here's I'm going to put this little quick video of us all doing our makeup together. I started basically by researching inclusive arts practice, but then also talking to the participants of the group, and wanting to find out what they wanted to discover, what they wanted to explore, what they wanted to do. And they decided in the 4 weeks they wanted to look at how to create a character, how to be moving like a drag queen. They wanted to use their voice, and they wanted to do makeup. So each week we took a different theme, and we explored in a 2-hour masterclass on a Sunday evening. We explored activities and ideas around each of those themes. We'd do an activity, and then we'd talk and reflect about it, find out, and develop and build it up that way. Most important thing that we did, like I say, is that we did it together. Alongside that, we used social media as a tool. Now, I fully acknowledge that social media isn't hugely accessible, and lots of people really struggle with it. I was lucky enough that the group that I worked with, I already knew that they could and were quite familiar with social media, so they were able to access it. So we used Facebook page as a way of sharing ideas, suggesting things to do, suggesting things to explore. It was a way to document our process. So we put everything, the videos of the sessions that we did, weekly challenges that we set onto social media where we could share the space. It was a place to feedback to each other, provide feedback on our project, on our work, to ask questions, share notes, and to communicate ideas. In that process, then, at the end of the period, we sat down and had a reflective session, and we discovered that drag helped us to see ourselves differently. there's huge stories behind these, and I haven't really got the time to go through it. But please email me or message me, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about this. But effectively, this participant felt that their learning disability meant that they had the mind of a child, and through doing the project, they were able to see their drag persona more as an adult. We also found that we could use our voice and be more assertive, and also find self-knowledge and understanding. So some of the theories behind these would be around role theory, and currently I'm exploring how the role of an arts therapist, drama therapist within the project, working with myself and the participants, might be a useful collaboration given the potential for transformation. I learned personally to trust was a big lesson. My participants really wanted to do things that I hate to say it, but at times I was like, oh no, they won't be able to do that. And that's not true. They completely showed to me that they were able to, oh, hang on a second, sorry, chat box just popping up. That they were able to do what I'd asked. So at one point I was giving them glue to glue over their eyebrows and using pencils and things. I thought, oh, should they be using pencils close to their eye? And actually they nailed it. They were brilliant at it. I learned to be open, and I learned more about me and my art form and myself as a practitioner, and mostly to take risks. So the answer is, when two worlds collide, magic happens, and there's huge potential for individual and societal change. Obviously, in a 4-week process, I can't put any claim to those, but there's certainly scope for further exploration of this idea and this project, and seeing where it goes. It's kind of really taken off, actually. In the last month or two, we've had numerous requests to perform. We've appeared on Electric Umbrella TV, we've performed for Innovate Trust, we've been booked for an online Pride event, we've started to collaborate with the dance company Kitchen Sink, and it's just really taken off. So the next steps, sorry, I'm whizzing through this because I get these numbers. You're running out of time, Sparkles. Okay. We continue to work and explore together as a group, which we do every week. Currently, I'm in partnership with Mencap Cymru on a funding bid to take this project further. It's something they're hugely interested in taking further, and we continue to look for collaborations and participants. So there we go. There's my social media tags. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat box, or email me at either these addresses on social media. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions if anybody has any. So as was said, please pop them in the chat. The chat function is now open.
And you can also, if you want to do the raise hand function and just, unmute yourself and ask the question directly, that's fine as well.
It's so interesting what you said there, though, Gareth, around how drag can release this potential within you and really defy what other people can, think of what the things that it is you can do.
Absolutely, yeah. So part of the process for me was reflecting on what drag had done to me, and I think if anybody watches RuPaul's Drag Race, I don't really like to drop it in as a thing to watch, but actually it's largely accountable to drag's mainstream success at the moment. If you watch any of that, you'll see people talking about their experiences of drag and what that's done. I mean, for instance, the first episode of the second series of the UK Drag Race, where Lawrence Chaney breaks down and has no confidence in his when he's presenting male outside of drag. He finds that really difficult to have that confidence, but then he says that through drag he's been able to find that voice and find that confidence. So it's something that's not just it's not just a performance thing. It's not just something that we do to entertain. It actually does have a huge transformation on yourself. For me, I discovered a lot about myself through performing in drag. In the first, one of the biggest lessons for me was that being able to accept myself and accept the way that I am sometimes. Quite often, when I was younger, people would, the oppression of bullies and stuff, and just be like, why am I so feminine sometimes, and why does my bum wobble? But actually, drag's like, do you know what, screw that. You can do that, you can be that person, and that's, so it's a really good playground for exploring yourself.
And you made a really good point there that it's for absolutely everyone as well. We've had some comments in the chat saying, could you pop your social media handles in the chat? And we've had one from Alexander, who has said that this stuff is super interesting. I totally agree. And that they think they think you could help them into some research as well. Sparkle studies. Got a ring to it.
Yeah, do it. Sorry, I'm trying to multitask. House of Deviant is the Facebook page. Ernie Sparkle's on all social media. My email address at Hotmail. I'm completely open to conversation and further exploration of this. So anybody who's interested or wants a further conversation or parts of research, I'd be more than happy to speak to you. I've just seen that message from Nix. That Tramshed event was one of the best events I've ever attended and really opened up the world of drag to me. Absolutely. I'm so glad you were there, Nix. How wonderful.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much. As you can see, your legacy lives on. So I'm going to hand over to Tanya now for our next speaker.
Wonderful. Thanks, Levin. So a real pleasure to present Dr. Ruth Gaffney-Rhys, who is an associate professor in law based in South Wales Business School. She specializes in family law, in particular the law relating to marriage and civil partnerships. Her research often has an international human rights element and frequently considers discrimination issues. She's also the co-director for the Centre for Gender Studies in Wales, who have also been really kind and having a website with all the descriptions and the bios for our participants today. So thank you, and go ahead, Ruth.
Thank you, Tanya. As indicated, I'm going to be talking about civil partnerships and also same-sex marriage from a legal perspective. Next slide, please. So first, I'll provide you with a little bit of background information relevant to my research. So the Civil Partnership Act was passed in 2004 to allow same-sex couples to enter into a formal relationship and acquire the same sort of rights and responsibilities as married couples have. And it was often referred to as marriage in all but name. Then in 2013, the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act was passed to allow same-sex couples to marry. But what it didn't do was extend civil partnerships to opposite-sex couples. So despite the fact that the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act was presented by the government as an equality measure, it didn't actually achieve equality. And that's something I explored in the paper indicated on the slide there. So today I'm going to summarise the arguments I made in this paper, but also update you on what has happened since I wrote this paper. Next slide, please. So this slide shows what the problems were with the legislation that was passed in 2013. So as I said, it allowed same-sex couples to marry, but it didn't allow opposite-sex couples to form a civil partnership. So same-sex couples actually had more choices in terms of what type of relationship they enter into, and I mean legal relationship, than opposite-sex couples did. This was objectionable from the perspective of opposite-sex couples, and it makes it sound as if same-sex couples were treated better. However, the fact that you had this difference in treatment did actually disadvantage same-sex couples as well. So firstly, it meant that civil partnerships were considered inferior to marriage. It was very clear from the government statements issued around the time of the legislation that marriage was the ultimate prize and that civil partnerships were an inferior relationship. And in fact, the legislation allowed civil partners to convert their relationship into a marriage after same-sex marriage was introduced. But you can't convert a marriage into a civil partnership. So the legislation is making it clear that you can upgrade a civil partnership into a marriage. And what this actually means is, by implication, same-sex relationships were considered inferior to opposite-sex relationships, because civil partnerships were inferior to marriage, and civil partnerships at the time were reserved for same-sex couples. And that was clearly a very problematic stance to take. There were also issues in relation to trans people. Following the introduction of same-sex marriage, a trans person that wanted to legally change gender could stay married as long as their spouse consented. So an opposite-sex marriage would become a same-sex marriage, and a same-sex marriage would become an opposite-sex marriage. But because opposite-sex civil partnerships were not legally possible, a trans person in a civil partnership could not legally change gender and stay in the civil partnership. They would either have to annul the civil partnership, dissolve the civil partnership, or convert it into a marriage. So we had a major issue there for trans people that were in civil partnerships. So in summary, equality wasn't achieved. Next slide, please. So I then argued in favour of extending civil partnerships to opposite-sex couples. And my legal arguments were based on international human rights, and in particular, the right to private life, the right to equality, and the right to dignity and autonomy. So the right to private and family life is contained in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So I argued that this includes the right to make choices about the type of relationship you want to enter into, and to have those choices respected by law. Connected to Article 8 is Article 14, which says that everyone should enjoy the rights set out in the Convention without discrimination of any kind. And as I've indicated, the way the legislation was worded was discriminatory. And then also I referred to Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, upon which really all international human rights instruments are based. And Article 1 says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and they are endowed with reason and conscience, which really means they are autonomous individuals and should be respected as such and able to make decisions about their life, and those decisions should be respected in law. And I referred to key case law of the European Court of Human Rights, etc., in order to support my arguments. And essentially, I summed up by saying that it was not sustainable to retain this position, and that civil partnerships had to be extended to opposite-sex couples for the benefit not just of opposite-sex couples, but same-sex couples and trans people also. Next slide, please. Just to also highlight, there were other issues with the legislation, other differences in treatment between opposite-sex spouses and same-sex spouses. So firstly, there were restrictions on same-sex weddings taking place in religious buildings. Secondly, the grounds for annulling an opposite-sex marriage and same-sex marriage was slightly different. You can't annul a same-sex marriage on the basis that it hasn't been consummated. In relation to divorce, there is a problem in relation to adultery. In both cases, you can divorce based on adultery, but the legislation actually defines adultery in a heterosexual way. And there were also differences in terms of pension rights until this was overruled by the Walker case in 2017. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to talk about what has happened since I wrote that paper in 2013. So firstly, The government issued a review of civil partnerships in 2014 and set out some options for change. So they could do nothing, they could extend civil partnerships to opposite sex couples, they could abolish civil partnerships entirely. And based on that consultation, the government decided to do nothing. They said there was no loud call for change, we'll leave things as they are. This was then challenged by an opposite sex couple, Rebecca Steinfeld and Charles Keaton, who were a young couple living together with children, who were opposed to marriage on philosophical grounds. And there are lots of opposite sex couples who view marriage as traditional, patriarchal, and they don't want to form that relationship. In the High Court, their claim was unsuccessful. The High Court declared Article 8 to be inapplicable because it was not, according to the court, a serious interference with their private and family life. But in the Court of Appeal, the court disagreed and said Article 8 was applicable, but it was justified to wait and see for a while to see how popular civil partnerships were after the introduction of same-sex marriage. And then finally in 2018, the Supreme Court in the Steinfeld case declared that civil partnerships had to be extended to opposite sex couples. Next slide, please. So in 2019, legislation was passed to allow opposite sex couples to form civil partnerships. And the first civil partnerships took place on 31st of December 2019, and 167 opposite sex couples formed a civil partnership. And as I've explained, this was not just a good thing for opposite sex couples, it removed some of the issues that I talked about relating to same-sex couples and trans people. Other developments, in June last year, the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act was passed. It's not in force yet. It's anticipated it'll come into force in the autumn. It removes fault from divorce proceedings. So you will no longer base a divorce on adultery. And as a consequence, the problematic heterosexual definition of adultery will be removed from the law. So that's a positive development. But today in 2021, some issues do still remain. The issues I talked about earlier in relation to annulment still exist. So you can annul a marriage on the basis of non-consummation, but not, or you can annul an opposite sex marriage, but not a same-sex marriage on the basis of non-consummation. And for me, that's a lack of acknowledgement that same-sex couples are likely to enter into a sexual relationship. But also the fact that you can't convert a marriage into a civil partnership still marks a civil partnership as an inferior relationship, which is not satisfactory. So complete equality has not yet been achieved. Next slide. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was so interesting how it's fluctuated over the years. So feel free to pop your comments in the chat if you have any questions for Ruth, or if you want to use the raise hand function, and you can unmute yourself and ask Ruth directly. It's so interesting that there's so many differences then in terms of civil partnership, and what do you think? Was there a public response to either these kind of key developments throughout? Did you observe anything?
There has been a public response, and when the consultation paper was issued on same-sex marriage, and equally the consultation on civil partnerships, there was a substantial amount of people that were in favour of creating true equality and having both relationships available to same-sex and opposite-sex couples. The problem really was the government could not see why opposite-sex couples would want a civil partnership, because for them, marriage was the ultimate prize. And if marriage was available to you, why would you want this other relationship? And that was the main stumbling block, really. And their hand was forced in the end by the Supreme Court declaring the position to be illegal. They wouldn't have changed the law otherwise. So it does emphasise the importance of legal research and challenging laws on legal grounds, human rights grounds, etc., because it can result in change, as we've seen.
And it's also interesting how then sometimes, and I heard that from another talk, looking at when the public influences law, but sometimes the law influences the public, and looking at that relationship.
Yeah.
We have a message from Kay. Hi, Kay. I think the issue is additionally compounded as well, as we don't have legal recognition for non-binary people. And there is still such a binary approach to the law and legal system with categorizing gender. There are additional issues with people not being able to get married or enter a civil partnership as they're not legally allowed to be themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I only briefly touched on one trans issue today, but there are a whole host of issues connected to gender, transgender, non-binary. I could have talked about issues relating to parenthood, to the fact that if you give birth to a baby, you have to be a mother no matter what gender you identify as. There are issues in relation to same-sex female couples having children. The female that doesn't give birth to the baby is not legally classed as a mother. You are either male or female as far as the law is concerned. There are lots of issues with the law that I could have talked about today. I just, obviously for time, focused on one, but Kay is quite right. There are lots of other issues out there, and the law does tend to lag behind what society is doing and feeling. Sometimes it's quite slow to respond.
Completely agree. Well, thank you so very much, Ruth.
So we are now going to be joined by Dr. Sarah Cruz. Dr. Sarah Cruz is a senior lecturer in performance and media at the University of South Wales. Sarah's research lies in the intersections between performance studies, boxing, and physical culture. Sarah's recently co-authored the monograph Boxing and Performance, Mimetic Hauntings. But without much further ado, Dr. Sarah Cruz.
Thank you very much. My title today is The Bleeding Space, and it's just some really great connections already with some discussions that have already come about. The idea of performance in the everyday, legal discrimination, that lag behind institution following cultural changes, and particularly ideas around breaking binaries, I think I'd like to pick up on today. So just obviously as a brief warning, I'm going to talk about blood, if that isn't obvious already. So as a performance studies scholar, I focus on the framing of female bodies in boxing, and specifically I'm interested in the connections between femininity, aggression, and blood. Equal parts performative, playful, and political, the female boxer is resilient and rageful in her forward-moving pursuit for change. The female boxer, I'm suggesting, performs a powerful and poetic declaration as she navigates the hostile territory of a male-dominated sport. The female boxer enacts an embodied manifesto every time she enters the ring. And here I'm drawing on the work of Brianne Fears, who argues that the manifesto is crucial for individuals demanding societal change. Manifesto, she says, do the transformative work of hoping and destroying, reflecting and violently ending things. And I feel we need these radical and poetic declarations because, as I argue, too often readings of female bodies and indeed female blood in popular culture are reductive, limiting and damaging. As a female body performing the manly sport of boxing, British welterweight Jane Couch was labelled, quote, an animal, a freak, barbaric for women, unquote. In 1998, Couch was forced to endure a 6-month court case against the British Board of Boxing Control's restriction of trade. Women, according to the board, are, quote, too fragile to box and they bruise easily, unquote. The core focus of the board's defence of refusing Couch a boxing licence was Couch's natural reed, soft body. by purportedly putting her body at risk of irreversible damage that was ostensibly greater than any male boxer might face, Couch was heavily criticised by the press and in court for subverting gender norms, for going against nature. The board's concerns regarding Couch's femininity were backed by a medical advisor and a legal team who concurred that sanctioning female boxing was far too big a risk to take. Rhetoric of the case was shrouded in pathologizing and misogynistic claims about women, driven by patriarchal concerns purporting to protect female bodies. In actuality, the key line of defense against Couch had seemingly far more to do with protecting the ideological positions of British boxing than it did in demonstrating any conclusive evidence that women's bodies were at greater risk of harm than men's. Boxing, after all, is a sport in which men play out what it means to be a man, where the ring becomes a space for the power of dominant masculinities to play out. But the speculative medical evidence presented argued that women experience, quote, premenstrual tension, which makes them emotional and more liable and accident prone. They may also be unknowingly in the early stages of pregnancy, and they might be prone to breast cancer due to being punched in the chest repeatedly, unquote. The repetition of the term might here highlights the lack of persuasive force and clarity in the board's arguments against women's boxing. During the trial, the board, its legal team and medical advisors were consistent only in reinforcing the so-called differences between male and female bodies. Differences, however, that reaffirmed women's responsibility for reproduction and that cast Couch as careless, reckless, and abnormal for putting her body at risk of injury. The case of Couch versus the board and the surrounding media discourses highlight the contradictory and frustrating double bind the female boxers and female bodies more generally are often caught between. On one hand, Couch's body, her reproductive organs, her breasts required protecting, but on the other hand, Couch's physicality was repulsive and unnatural. She was monstrous. Couch's body was unruly, according to the board, and the refusal to grant her a boxing license can be read as disciplinary action against Couch's purported defiance. But whether female boxers are forced to forego atypical femininity in order to perform the sport, or they've consciously chosen what queer studies theorist Jack Halberstam terms abject gender expressions, neither can escape the formulation as boxing as harmful to so-called female biology. Even now, the fears of undisclosed pregnancies, the risk of damage to women's breasts, and even the concern that women are more predisposed to concussions than men are rooted in boxing rule and regulation. But key to the board's dispute against Couch was the incorrect assumption that all women menstruate, and therefore all women experience PMS. However, the fact that the defence ignored how many women, cis or trans, do not menstruate, and their choice to focus on PMS, a presumed effect of menstruation rather than menstrual bleeding itself, reinforced just how comfortable men are at making decisions about women's bodies, and yet how uncomfortable they are at talking about the details of female bodies that cannot be contained. Leaky, hairy, overtly fleshy female bodies are considered monstrous, dangerous, and unruly. Fast forward almost 25 years, and boxing's gatekeepers have done a complete U-turn in gesture since women's boxing became a very lucrative business opportunity. When Matchroom's Eddie Hearn signed Irish Olympian and now professional boxer Katie Taylor in 2016, he declared that, quote, "It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, it's completely irrelevant. It's about a product breaking through," unquote. The key point here is that whilst women's boxing is on the rise, as Sky Sports would have it, it nevertheless makes a massive difference if you're male or female in the sport, if only in terms of accessibility and opportunities. However, I'm not here to recite the myriad of inequalities still facing female boxers, or the myopic views of patriarchal institutions that are threatened by female athletes who demonstrate physical skill and mastery in their bodies. I'm here to make the case that blood as a material substance in boxing might help us rethink the gendered double bind that boxing bodies typically find themselves caught between. The presence of blood, after all, is a material reminder that our bodies are not static. They're engaged in a continual process of transformation and renewal. Boxing bodies are not fixed, they're permeable in a state of flux and change. Superficial projections of gender may cast bodies as either rigidly masculine or feminine in form, but as conversations about gender have shown, femininity and masculinity belong on part of a spectrum of gendered expressions. They don't belong to particular types of bodies. When blood emerges in boxing, most frequently from the cut above the boxer's eye or a damaged mouth or nose, the cut person in the boxer's corner does their best to halt the flow of blood between rounds, blocking exposed soft tissue through a combination of cotton buds, Vaseline, and oftentimes magic. But once back in the ring, the boxer's blood moves between their own body and that of their opponent. The blood spills, it trickles, and sometimes begins to pour. The boxer returns to their corner, takes their wooden stool, and the cut person goes to work once more. Phew, safe for one more round at least. I follow the trace and flow of blood in boxing, how the blood moves from one body to another, from materials, the boxer's clothes, the referee's shirt, the ring canvas, to buckets in the corner for when the boxers used to discard blood or mucus from their mouth or nose. The activity of blood in boxing fascinates me because we rarely take the time to pause and think about the status of blood in boxing and in life more generally. The sight of bloodied, sweating bodies in boxing, the sound of mucus being pulled from the back of a boxer's throat as he spits between rounds might be unpleasant, but these are commonplace in contrast to conversations about menstrual blood, which even conversely manages to incite feelings of fear and panic. Bloodied, bleeding and bruised male boxers have frequently been adorned as warriors or mocked for their fragility of their flesh and skin. But the sights of bloodied, bleeding and bruised female boxers are new and should not be underestimated in their importance. Whilst it is important to acknowledge that only particular types of blood are normalised in public spaces, I'm referring, of course, to how the blood spilt from a cut box is tolerated, whereas menstrual blood is not only taboo, but a huge barrier of access to sport for young women and girls. We still cannot ignore how female boxers stand in the ring, bloodied and bruised, strong and defiant, showcasing and celebrating what female bodies are capable of. Bloodied and bruised female boxers, I'm suggesting, are also a powerful antidote to the reoccurring images of the bloodied and bleeding female bodies that we see in popular culture. Until I began boxing at 23, I had rarely seen a bloodied and bruised female body that was not a victim of patriarchal violence. From true crime series to horror films to images described on the news, popular culture is saturated with the presence of bloodied and bleeding female bodies that are postured as damaged and broken. Yet conversations about menstruation still bring about shame and disgust. The repetition of concealing blood performed by the cut person between rounds might very well echo the ways in which young women and girls are taught to repress their rage and indeed repress their menstrual cycle through a combination of medication, silencing and discipline in their unruly bodies. But the female boxer is well practiced at going against expectations, punching past the rigid doctrine that tells young female bodies they cannot be strong, angry or messy. Just as the flow of blood from the boxer's wound can only be patched and contained temporarily, the lingering attempts to repress femininities that go against patriarchal expectations of women and girls can only last so long. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Oh.
I've upset someone.
She's mad at the patriarchy, she is. She agrees with everything you said. Can't make it up, you know. No, but you've raised some really interesting points there. So much I've never considered myself. And, you know, the chat's open for anyone to ask any questions. But one of the things I wanted to maybe ask you was, you know, that distinction between seeing women bleeding, but often in a victim status, how people are comfortable with that. But not in a more powerful kind of stance, like in sports, in boxing. You know, I know you've mentioned it. Oh, here we are. Someone else has got a question as well. So Stuart has got a question.
I was just going to mention, sorry, it reminded me doing a little bit of work with John Hayton in our science department about, I guess, similar issues of world rugby excluding trans women from women's rugby on a basis of an argument that, you know, men are bigger than women essentially. And it struck me as a very similar sort of mindset of, you know, we need to protect the women from these enormous trans women. It was much the same sort of thing. And I guess having, you know, watched a bit of rugby, there's blood and so on in that as well. But it just reminded me of that piece of work we're doing as well there. John's involved in the gay men's rugby group or whatever it's called, trying to reverse that view. And it's interesting that none of the national rugby organisations, as far as I know, have actually taken on the World Rugby's view on that one. So they've all looked at it and think, well, that's ludicrous. So it was an interesting thing to hear, similar parallels in boxing.
Yeah, and I think so new as well, this research, you know, part of making the case for trans and non-binary participation in sport is we haven't even yet done the research into the purported differences between male and female bodies. There's so many assumptions made, concussion, you know, being such a debatable one, but so much of the research on concussion is based on how the participant themselves responds to medical questioning afterwards. And when we know that men in particular have been brought up to silence, and that, you know, they don't talk as openly about injury as women do in that kind of gendered assumption. Of course, reports of female concussion would be higher if we say that. But yeah, it's fascinating, particularly with again, very aggressive, so-called aggressive sports like rugby.
Contact sports. So yeah, the aim is to hit against each other, whatever, however you control that. Yeah.
Yes.
It was just interesting. It was you know, it was about, well, men are bigger, therefore trans women will injure, and it just ignored the data and the range of weights there are in both men's and women's rugby and all sorts of things, as well as, you know, the whole thing about protecting women. It didn't prevent, you know, an 8-stone jockey trans man trying to play rugby when he'd be completely steamrolled, but it did prevent a 14-stone trans woman from playing rugby.
Yeah. Wow.
What's interesting as well is in both of those, the discussions are being made about people without them being involved as well in the conversation. But I can see Tanya's got her hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree. I mean, I've been training. I've been training in boxing for the past 3 years in Krav Maga, and, you know, inhabiting those spaces has been quite tricky. You know, I really agree with a lot of the things you were saying, Sarah, because it seemed like there were additional battles that I had to overcome, or I had to prove myself, rather than, you know, from some of my colleagues, I was called aggressive, or even some of the female counterparts in the boxing were trying to go, oh, you know, you're going a bit overboard, or this is. So it was really interesting that there are so many differences there illustrated in the training, and also assumptions from coaches, and it was such an really, really difficult yet intriguing space to be in. And most of these norms were established by the coaches and, you know, the teachers in the space as well. Because there was on the flip side, on a different gym, I was legitimized. So oh, she's a boxer. Right? And I'm like, well, I'm a dancer and a lecturer, so I'm not a boxer, but but I was already introduced into the space. But it's and then I started thinking about how are we going to make that into a safe space for queer people, and how that that exchange would even take place, or was I safe to even be queer in a boxing space? So
it's amazing, because I think from a community up, a grassroots level up, my experience is that is a far more progressive way than institutional. Like, I found a boxing gym a safer space than academia to begin with, you know, in terms of the assumptions that are made. But there's a wonderful, just to conclude, there's a wonderful group that we've just partnered with now, who are based in Brooklyn in New York, called Trans Boxing, who use boxing very much like drag, as Gareth described drag, as a way of exploring physically the possibilities of the body. And so I think from grassroots level up, that progress will be made, but legally and on the mainstream stage, I think we're always going to be in a huge delay and deficit, for sure.
And thank you for that. It definitely takes trailblazers like yourself as well to keep pushing that narrative that everyone should be involved. We've had a question from Stephanie in the inbox as well. So maybe that's something you could direct message and answer to there as we go on to Tanya with our next speaker.
Wonderful.
Great. Oh, that was great. Such a interesting mix of speakers. So I'm here to present Dr. Stuart Ayres, who is the Dean of Computing, Engineering and Science with a research background in astronomy. Arising from a long-standing interest in activity and public engagement with science, he has supported work to widen the experiences and identities of those working within STEM subjects. His aims include making the disciplines more attractive to a wider range of participants and enhancing the impact of research by introducing more diverse perspectives. So with you, Dr. Stuart Ayres.
So just to start off by saying, I'm unlike our previous speakers. I haven't researched the experience of LGBT people in any context, but I'm going to be talking about my perceptions of those experiences of LGBT plus people in STEM disciplines and some of the things we're doing about that. As I say, my interest is in making the STEM disciplines open to as many people as possible so that they all contribute and benefit from that. And increasingly, of course, science, technology, engineering and maths, which that abbreviation stands for, is becoming more and more important in our society in a way that it never was in the past, although of course technology has always been fantastically important. STEM itself is a little bit fuzzy. It's a group of subjects, and I'm thinking of them as academic disciplines, primarily in academic settings and in universities. But of course, many of the industries that use particularly science and technology and engineering are heavy employers of graduates from those subjects. So whatever happens in universities has an impact way beyond higher education. But it is a group of subjects that are policed internally and externally in a way that often LGBT plus as a grouping is as well. And politicians will include or exclude things from STEM depending on what their priorities are, for example. I think a really important thing to consider it is still a group of disciplines that are majority men, majority people participating in them, studying them, working in STEM industries are men. But it does vary considerably across those subjects. So, for example, engineering is usually considered 80 or 90% men. It varies a little bit between the different subdisciplines. Physics, my own area, 80% men. Computing similarly dominated by men, which is interesting given its origins in mathematics, which is much more balanced in terms of its gender representation, and the fact that two antecedents of computing that are widely accepted are Ada Lovelace, who was a woman who in the 19th century essentially invented the concept of programming that we now use in computing, and Alan Turing, a gay man who lived in the middle of the 20th century, and apart from being a war hero, was also came up with some of the ideas around thinking of computers as thinking machines, which is a completely unique idea. And despite those origins in both mathematics and with those people, it's become something that's been dominated by men, with of course all the heteronormative masculinity issues that would rise. Other subjects in STEM, so for example, biology is a majority women, psychology, a significant majority of women participating in those areas. So again, there are variations across that. And even in the last three, however, particularly in universities, men still tend to dominate the senior roles. They're certainly overrepresented compared with the representation in the general group of people involved. My point being here that, of course, a large part of STEM are heavily biased towards men, especially when one considers that most employees are in STEM subjects are in engineering and technology businesses. So, the largest single group is particularly dominated by men. So one might expect from our experiences in general that STEM also excludes people across other axes of differentiation. And in addition, at least in my perception, attempts to change the imbalances focus very much on the individual. So to give an example, the Engineering Council's approach over the last 10 or 15 years of trying to increase the representation of women in engineering has been, I could simplify as change the woman. Encourage girls to study engineering, encourage women to continue as engineers, because why wouldn't you want to? Being an engineer is a fantastic thing, rather than change the subject, rather than change the discipline. So changing STEM subjects to be more inclusive and attractive of the people who are currently represented in them. So that focus on changing the participants rather than the subject is pretty key. There's also a tendency to think that therefore the identity of, for example, a scientist is dictated by the nature of the science, rather than thinking that perhaps science or engineering or mathematics is actually been dictated by the scientists, engineers, and mathematicians of the past and present. So again, there's something about engineering, there's something about mathematics that then dictates the sort of person that participated in it as some sort of almost natural outcome of the way it is. So for me, the two questions, obviously, as a scientist, is actually, are LGBT people, and the expectation would be that they'd be underrepresented in the STEM subjects, but are they actually? Well, there's plenty of data out there. I've actually got a second question I'm going to come to that I'm a little bit more interested in, but I'll just show you a little bit of data. There's plenty of other studies. So this is from a study in America of just over 4,000 college students, so US college students doing their degrees between 2011 and 2015, and saying, okay, those that started on a STEM major in 2011, how many of them subsequently graduated with a STEM major in 2015? And we can see that the orange column there, the central column, is the majority of the respondents were heterosexual, and over 70% of those completed their STEM degree, whereas what they've described as a sexual minority grouping, so everybody else, is 7 percentage points worse off. And when you look into the paper, there's additional things that make that look even worse. I mean, that's obviously bad enough. But for example, the people in the sexual minority group are more likely to engage in undergraduate research, and those that engage in undergraduate research are 13% more likely to then succeed in their STEM major. So despite the fact that they're more likely to be engaged in that thing that then leads towards greater success, they've still got a 7-point difference. And so it demonstrates quite strongly that the STEM subjects are not as inclusive as they should be, and there's plenty of other studies that suggest that as well. What I'm interested though is STEM different? So do we exclude people for different reasons? Do people feel that they need to leave an engineering profession for different reasons than they might feel that they're being excluded elsewhere? Do they feel less included than they might be? Certainly underlying that is a perception about our culture in STEM. So I'm just going to show a couple of quotes from a study, a questionnaire from 2 years ago by the Institute of Physics, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and the Royal Astronomical Society, which was a study into, or a questionnaire of physical scientists, and about 40% of the respondents were students, about 40% were people with STEM degrees working out in industry, whether they were STEM industries or not, and about 20% were academics. And there's two parts of quotes here that I'm taking from that. The first one was from a cisgender man who's gay. Science is impartial and shouldn't have politics. Therefore, scientists must be amorphous, faceless things without any identity or any politics. And he was saying that in a wider context, the wider quote is pointing out that, of course, this is rubbish, that his identity matters, the identity of his fellow, I think this person happens to be a scientist, the fellow scientists is incredibly important, and affects the science. But of course, the cultural perception, certainly within the science, was that it was irrelevant. And the second one is from a cisgender man who's heterosexual, who also responded, as to why this questionnaire is asking such childish questions is beyond me. We're all just scientists. So this was, again, a fragment of code which demonstrated this person had what might be considered the orthodox view that science and your personal views, personal circumstances, or and so on are unconnected. And actually, if you're going to be a good scientist, you don't need to worry about those things. The science is naturally immune because of its objectivity to any such biases. So that presents two views there. And then in a paper on queer identity in STEM, again, these are two statements from their introduction, saying in more formal language, much the same thing. STEM fields are often stereotypes of spaces in which personal identity is subsumed in the pursuit of a single-minded focus on objective scientific truths. And socialization processes in these fields often encourage a belief that human differences do not interfere with the pursuit of rational and unbiased investigations. And again, this is about saying that to people that you're not a good scientist or a good engineer if you concern yourself with these other matters of identity, sexuality, etc., and how you might be excluded by the culture. And indeed, they talk in this paper about the difference between LGBT models of identity being psychological or sociological, whereas STEM models of identity being professional socialization or organizational norming. It's essentially fitting in and having to fit with the culture rather than the culture accepting and adapting to you. What I've not seen at the moment is a specific evidence of a differential experience in STEM compared to elsewhere. I've not found any studies of that. So lots of studies about how it's less inclusive than it should be. but not how it is might be different. And I think that's an interesting thing to explore. So, of course, what we do therefore is draw on lived experience. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the things we've been doing to support LGBT plus people in STEM to improve both the environment they are in and support them in being in the current environment. Obviously, LGBT people in STEM are not included as they should be. And therefore, we do the standard thing of trying to work to improve inclusion for a better future reality and supporting LGBT plus people to deal with the current reality, sometimes presented as a dichotomy, and of course we need to do both. At a talk recently, Julia Gilliard, the former politician, spoke about the fact that we need to do both, and she was talking specifically about women in politics, but we need to be able to do both. We need to support the current people in the current environment as well as working to change. So we've been running events across STEM, raising awareness, but also providing the space for LGBT plus people in STEM. One of them is the annual LGBT plus Steminar every January. So this is a research conference, predominantly of early career research, predominantly in academia, talking about and presenting their research to a group of LGBT group of scientists and engineers in a context where the only thing they have to concern themselves with is being a fantastic researcher and not any reaction the audience might have to anything else about them, any other aspect of their identity. And also we discuss, the issues that arise and what we might do to improve and the experiences of different places so that we can share those experiences. The International Day of LGBT plus people in STEM, this has been going for about 3 years now. This year it moved to the 18th of November, and on the 18th of November, the university ran a panel event of 4 people from industry coming to talk about their, coming online to talk about their LGBT, the experiences of LGBT plus people in STEM-led industries. I think we had Welsh Water, a couple of civil engineering agencies, and a company in the northeast of England that was working on computer science IT area. And then on the same week, Transgender Day of Remembrance, where Izzy Jayasinghe at Sheffield University spoke about her experiences, both about her science and her experiences as a trans woman moving from New Zealand to across various parts of the world to the UK. So that's just me talking very briefly about LGBT people in STEM. Happy to take any questions and discussion. And I'm just showing there the references that I've used there to provide those sources. Thank you.
Wonderful, Stuart. Thank you. Don't know if can't see your video at the moment. Yeah, feel free to pop up some questions. I remember, I was there at your event of LGBT and STEM, and I was just wondering if you could did you have any kind of lasting impressions of that event? How did you see any impact on it?
I think we had, I'm sorry, I didn't have my video on there. Sorry, so we should. I think it had an impact for some of the students that were attending, realizing that they were in some cases not alone. When you're in a massively men-dominated environment, then tends, of course, to be mainly heterosexual men. It's a very masculine, heteronormative environment. So I think realizing you're not alone is important. Recognizing that significant employees in industry and sectors of industry were able to were working and being inclusive. So we had we had somebody from Dirk-Henry who specifically was involved in that, and I think that helped enormously. We had and it wasn't totally positive. We had one of the speakers, a transgender woman who was running her own civil engineering consultancy, in part because actually working in the big business she was originally in turned out to be more difficult than it should have been. So it was very positive in that sense. I think it was also really helpful to the staff, who, of course, a lot of them have worked only in universities, so they've not had that experience in other industries. Engineering is not true, actually. A lot of our engineering staff have worked in industry, but to be able to reflect the current status of support for their LGBT plus students when they become graduates was really important. I think we need to do some more work on that in terms of broadening out what we do on that, particularly on the LGBT plus day in STEM, International Day of STEM events, just to broaden it out a little bit more. But you know, we were taking small steps. I get, yeah. So we happen to have 2 gay men and 2 trans women speak at that event. So there's obviously a bit more we could do around that. But I was pleased with how we were able to get people in for that.
Yeah, and I remember that being quite impactful, hearing their experiences of discrimination or acceptance, because they were positive messages also conveyed.
How they'd worked through that. I mean, my to me it was, and this is probably not a surprise, that the 2 gay men obviously had found it had been more easily accepted than the trans women, and that's not too surprising, I guess, from our wider experience.
But it's important that these types of events keep happening and popping up. I think it's a first step. Hopefully it becomes a yearly ritual.
Yeah, and it's only part of what we need to do, but it's important to do.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Great. I think I'm going to hand it over to Bleddyn, who's going to hand it over to me.
That's exactly what's happening. You know, it's like that part on Bridget Jones when they invent the person on. But yes, actually, I'm really pleased that I can do this, which is to introduce you in this event. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Tanya Akron is a lecturer at USW, a dance movement psychotherapist, performer, and movement director. And I'm really happy to say a close friend of mine, and works quite closely with me on LGBTQYMRU. A master of all. Acarón offers international workshops on a movement for well-being, therapeutic work with the LGBTQ+ community, embodied decision-making, and violence prevention. And recently founded her own movement for well-being company, the Body Hotel Limited. So without much further ado, it is my privilege to hand over to Dr. Tanya Akron.
Oh, thank you, Levin. Also, I'm very proud to be a member of the editorial board for LGBTQYMRU and supporting in any way I can. I know that it's 1:45. We're scheduled to be here until 2:30. But I wanted us, we've been staring at the screen, and I know, you know, it's a lonely world out here because I haven't seen any cameras, but that's okay. What I wanted us to do before we started, before I started speaking, was just to have a moment to just stand up and walk around your computer if you can. Just have a moment to just stand up. I do this in every single session, but take a moment to close your eyes and just stare away from the screen and just give yourself a little bit of a shake. And just place your hands, if you can, on your belly and just take a moment to just feel your feet and take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Just have a moment to disconnect from the screen very briefly, since we're not going to have a bit of a comfort break, and we're just going to open up your eyes. Going to return slowly. It's very 2 seconds, but sometimes it's really important to connect back. So I'm going to share my screen. Is everyone able to see that?
Yes, we can see.
Excellent. So today, I have to go back. I want to speak to you about a kind of a project that's been going on for about 8 years. I've been a dance woman psychotherapist for about 15. And in 2009, started working with the LGBT+ community almost exclusively. And that's been my practice since then. So hopefully in this presentation, I'm gonna do a whistle stop tour, as everybody has been forced to do, but talk to you a little bit about what dance woman psychotherapy is. I'm going to speak to you about some of the key aspects about a collaborative arts therapy project. So this is combining art psychotherapy and dance woman psychotherapy. And And then we're going to outline some of the key themes that we found in our research and our practice, because this material we published as a book chapter, gender differences, and I'll pop through the references for you at the end of the presentation. And then finally, look at body questions that I've kind of encountered in my therapeutic work with LGBT plus clients. So very briefly, after 15 years, I finally came up with my own definition of what dance women psychotherapy is. And it is a postgraduate level profession. It's been around to the 50s. And essentially what we do is intervene with the body. So we're combining psychotherapeutic techniques. This is a profession akin to counseling, psychotherapy. And we work with clients to develop, understand, and also repair their relationships with our bodies. I like to frame this in terms of clients asking themselves body questions. So we're looking at not only how we behave, but how we move through different situations, and then how our movement behavior is affected and affects others and our environment. And then hopefully we're looking at transforming that relationship. So this is part of the umbrella term of arts, the arts therapies, which is art, psychotherapy, music, drama, and dance. And today I wanted to talk to you about Under the Skin, which was a project where I worked with art therapist Alison Wren, where we looked at using two key interventions. And we started working together as part of an LGBTQ plus community organization in Scotland, and had been collaborating for over 8 years. And we were asked to collaborate in terms of a festival that was happening, which is the Scottish Arts and Mental Health Arts and Film Festival. And we were asked to do a workshop for queer people. And it was an inclusive workshop. And we used folk tales. So we used the folk tale of the Selkie Bride, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but essentially it is about this dichotomy between living your own truth, the internal essence, and some external demands. And we extracted some key LGBTQ plus themes from that and then explored them through movement and through art. And I'm here to kind of just focus on the movement and the body aspect of that. But from that experience, we've worked together throughout the years. And then last year, we were asked to do an international webinar through an International Creative Arts Therapies Association, which is based in China, IACAS. And what we've been doing is working together to look at training competencies. So how do we help mental health professionals, higher education professionals, look at creating safe spaces for LGBTQ plus clients? And in that activity, which is why you see that illustration of the glove done by the wonderful Susie Dory, who's a Cardiff-based artist, we used an intervention which was a latex, well, non-latex glove. We used that in our workshop a few years ago, but now for this webinar, this took on a very different shape, right? Because obviously the gloves now during the pandemic have taken on this dimension of protection and of safety. So we use this intervention of people use the gloves to draw on them, we moved with them, and we explored the notions of feeling protected, feeling safe, unsafe, and kind of moving through those difficulties and exploring that therapeutically. What we found then was that a lot of the research that we've seen is really has been really focused on coming out. But we had a very kind of driven mission to go, oh, actually, that is a really important part of therapeutic work, but what are other themes that we can explore? What are other themes that further research can keep delving into? And we found and we analyzed through these 3 themes, which are not, they're universal themes, right? But we were looking at how we could actually start thinking more about the different types of arts and those interventions, how we can actually help elucidate a bit those themes and clarify them further with different types of clients. And well, as you can see, one of them is like safe, unsafe. So looking at, well, one of the biggest challenges that we found is that a lot of LGBT plus clients have difficulty accessing mental health services or health services in general as well, due to a lot of discrimination, a lot of negative experiences, and a lot of professionals making LGBT plus clients feel really unsafe, and therefore that being a barrier to access. And that is something that actually propelled me to start working more on the therapist training side of things and developing more CPD with Alison, which we're hoping to roll out in 2021, 22, late 2021, because it is our mission to make this an integral part of training so that this doesn't happen. Also the notion of visibility and invisibility, what aspects do we make visible, also as therapists or as educators? How do we manage and negotiate sometimes these struggles with visibility, or when we're forced to become invisible? And also looking at, well, one aspect of psychotherapeutic practice is internalized homophobia, and working through that internal, sometimes that the external causes this notion of there's shame, or there's something that's wrong with you, right? As other people have mentioned that throughout the presentations, and that difficulty, right, that we found has been quite recurrent in the different workshops that we've done. And most of my workshops in Scotland were specifically working with the trans community, which is, you know, my greatest passion, and I'm very interested in the non-conforming body. So, and then I've found and encountered different aspects through the different interventions and through the different activities I've done with clients and with participants. And these are some of the questions that I'm kind of exploring and wanting to look at further research. And one of them obviously is violence and discrimination. That is a very ongoing, unfortunately, a very ongoing problem and challenge, particularly creating safe spaces for trans people. And that's been really, really challenging and difficult stories, but also stories of actually also the journey of self-identifying. That's not only with the trans community, but that's been something that I've found in a lot of the workshops that I've done with students and with participants, that we have a little struggle. It's an interesting struggle, a challenge and an opportunity to look at how we self-identify, accepting our bodies, accepting our process, accepting our identity, and also managing and negotiating these identities with others, because we underlying everything is that we want, regardless of how we identify, we really want to be seen, and we want to be acknowledged, and we want to be able to be safe to live out our truth. I know that sounds, you know, that sounds idealistic, but it's true. It's just a basic need of wanting to be seen and recognized for who we are. And then I've also encountered, and throughout my groups and dancing with psychotherapy, I've loved to play with gender expression, and sometimes that's very challenging, but looking at how femininity and masculinity are represented in movement, why do they have to exist in these binaries, and how we can also build in fluidity and start to challenge some of the cultural notions that we have in terms of what we deem masculine and what we deem feminine, and do we need to really have those categories? But one of the groups that I've done is we do a little play with hyper masculinity and hyper femininity, and a lot of the debates usually have to do a lot with the music and what's considered hyper feminine music or hyper masculine music. But it's been an interesting way to challenge and to understand actually the societal pressure that comes, and that there's some microcultural pressures that happen, and so it's been an interesting journey of trying to do that. Like I said, in the future, we're trying to see if we can do more workshops together, try to bring this kind of creative approach between arts therapies to more mainstream environments, dare I say mainstream, and trying to see how, how much more potential can we delve into. So essentially, yes, this is my presentation. Thank you so very much. And yeah, just open for questions.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for that. So the chat function is now open for any questions there. If people could take one thing away from this, Tanya, what would you want it to be? From your presentation, from what you're talking about, dance therapy and.
I mean, I think it's just that there's been so much emphasis on the word and emphasis on the screens lately, that I think it's really important that we don't neglect our bodies, and that that is a contested site, as a lot of people have mentioned throughout the presentations throughout today. And arts therapies have a really important contribution to do that. And then there needs to be more spaces where LGBTQ+ clients can access support without fear of being misunderstood, or fear more of being discriminated against, or being, feeling unsafe, which you really ultimately, I know it's not intentional, but ultimately you don't want any client feeling like that. Yeah.
We've had a question from Emily that says they're really interested in your understanding of non-normative bodies. Could you speak a bit more about how you would define that?
Yeah, so the non-conforming body is this notion that you're trying to really challenge, that the body challenges, receives and affects a lot of challenges into society and into the subcultures that we navigate. Non-conforming bodies is a general term for any kind of way of subverting or challenging traditional norms of what a body should do, right? So that includes LGBTQ+ clients, but also could be in any kind of underrepresented minorities, and any vulnerable communities, or people that feel oppressed. So in my work, it is about, because, an example comes to mind where I was asked to lead my first dance therapy group with the trans community, and the social worker who was in charge, she was brilliant. She said, they were asking deportment classes. They were asking for, so they did a survey for the participants. They wanted me to teach them how to move more like a woman. And I said, well, absolutely not. I can't do, I don't even know what that means, right? So, and then the social worker obviously knew, and she said to me, well, actually, I want you to just see if we can work on confidence, on building that confidence of finding your own walk and finding your own way of moving through. And I said, oh, that's brilliant. So that launched a whole series of workshops working with that, with the trans community. And it was really fun, and it was really wonderful to start looking at the fluidity and start thinking about us and our bodies as our ways of interacting with the world.
Fabulous. And we've got one more question here from Stephanie that says, as a participant of your movement workshops, including doing the exercise and performativity, it has been incredibly free and enjoyable, which is great to hear. How do you feel it benefits your practice and understanding of your work, bringing these workshops to people who do not necessarily identify as LGBTQ+?
Yeah, so that goes, thanks, Steph. Steph is from the MA Drama program, so I'm glad to see some students here and some familiar names. Wonderful, and thanks to the colleagues who've been supporting. For one of the basic principles of dance movement psychotherapy is that the wider the movement repertoire that we have, not that we learn, right, the wider coping skills we gain. So I think if we start we always think about reacting the same way to situations, and we don't have more adaptability, or we come to terms with rigidity, or we freeze, which happens a lot with anxiety, right? We start losing that ability to manage very different things, and things become overwhelming. So I think one of the basic principles that I like to enforce in my workshops is to start opening up possibilities. And this the concept of the open mind, right? But really, we do that by expanding awareness. We do that by expanding, looking at alternative creativity, for example, which has been an important example from the lockdown, right? So creativity and the arts allow that instrument to kind of tap into things that we've forgotten, like play and opening up, and looking, exploring potential and exploring possibilities, which is really what the work is about. So that's how I approach it. And you can be LGBTQ+, you can be an ally. For me, it really is about the body, and then cultivating a lifelong relationship with its challenges, which can be health related, or it can be, we all have our own battles with our bodies. So that's kind of how I approach this stuff. Thanks.
Fabulous, wonderful answers there. Well, thank you very much, Tanya. It's been super enlightening, and I think we're going to do that thing now where I'm going to start so you can introduce me, and then I'm going to start talking again.
Brilliant.
Oh, we didn't.
Yeah. Thank you for all the insightful questions. Beautiful. So yes, so last but not least, definitely not least, is Levin Harris, who is the founder of LGBTQYMRU, and they work as the organizational development and training officer for Senedd Cymru, which is a Welsh parliament. And Bleddyn's activism work has been featured on ITV Wales and BBC Radio Wales, a little celebrity. And Bleddyn delivers seminars and lectures on LGBTQ+ workplace inclusion for schools and organizations. So many of them, like Stonewall, National Trust, and many others. And very, very cool detail about Bleddyn is that Bleddyn was recognized on the Pink List as one of the top 15 LGBTQ+ community role models in Wales, with a poster in the Senedd, and is the chair of the Senedd award-winning LGBTQ+ staff network. So thank you, Bleddyn.
Thank you very much. That all, as you were reading that, that just makes me sound like I'm a professional gay, which, yeah, I am.
There you go.
But yeah, no, I'm here today to talk to you about LGBTQYMRU, what it is, where it came from, what you can expect from us from tomorrow morning, really. So I'm just gonna talk to you in a story mode, if I'm entirely honest. I'll take you back to April the 22nd, 2020. I was on one of those government-sanctioned walks, which many of us were so used to last year. And I'd seen the news about a new Pride event, another Pride event being cancelled because of the COVID-19 lockdown. And it wasn't too far from where I'm sat right now, actually. It was just around the corner, and I was like, this is devastating. And it was devastating personally for so many reasons. I started going to Pride when I was like 13, 14, telling my mother I was popping to my friends for the day, when in fact I was getting on a train down to Cardiff. And it was just an opportunity, as I've grown up, I've found more people just like me. I work with people just like me. I'm friends with people just like me. And when I say just like me, I mean people who are queer, not exclusively white or gay. But there's nothing quite like the feeling of going to Pride and just being surrounded by everyone or nearly everyone who is just like you, in a space where you're able to be your true, authentic self. You know, literally let your hair down, be who you know yourself to be, and feel safe in doing so. So I was devastated, and I mentioned from 13 to 14, I was going every year. So on that walk, I sent a text message to one person named Hannah, who organises Barry Pride with her partner Tom, and to another contact I had, Sue Vincent Jones. I was like, I've got an idea. We've got time for a conversation tomorrow. And that text and that call turned into the first Wales-wide virtual Pride, where we had over 30,000 viewers. We raised over £3,600 that we donated back into the community. We didn't keep it to make any money. We got it so that we could give it back, because we realized that funding was going to be an issue this year. And it was beautiful, because for the first time ever, really, in my experience of Prides, we had everyone from all across Wales, all in the same place, all at the same time, talking, at 7 panel discussions, talking about some phenomenal things around trans issues, about the need for Black Pride. We had UK Black Pride as part of the discussions around being LGBTQ plus in Wales, but having a global perspective of what it means to be LGBTQ plus, and it was phenomenal. And quite early into that, actually, we realised that we were doing something. We were filling a gap. We were creating an opportunity for people all across Wales and further afield, really. Welsh and Wales-based people. So if you're Welsh and you're living somewhere else, or you're in Wales, it's really for everyone that has that connection to Wales, that we've provided this opportunity. If just for 5 minutes, you're able to put your earphones in, turn it off, turn your screen on, whatever screen, and see people just like you, talking about issues that relate to you, living happy, successful lives, authentic lives, fighting for you even though they don't know you, then we've done our job. If someone in the middle of Wales who's never been able to make Pride before, because A, they're not out, or because it's too far away for them, could tune in and feel a part of a community, then we did our job. We did it all for one person, which then was amazing, because we had 30,000. And we'd realised that, and we wanted to continue to do it, which is where LGBTQYMRU, the magazine, came from. We'd realised there'd never been a Wales-wide LGBTQ plus, fully bilingual, free magazine. So we set about doing it. And it's been 10 months, and we've got over 20,000 volunteers then. We've got over 20 volunteers. We've recruited over 20 volunteers, Tanya of which is one, as an editorial board associate for the magazine. And I'm so pleased and excited and happy to tell you that as of tomorrow morning, we will be releasing the first ever Wales-wide LGBTQ plus, fully bilingual and free magazine, over 15,000 words across 85 pages, across our 4 themes, which are life, community, culture, and health and well-being. Available, bilingual, so in 2 languages, which is Welsh and English. And the important part about that as well is that, we recognise that it provides an identity for LGBTQ plus people within Wales. So we've recently talked about the opportunity to provide poetry, to allow people to submit poetry. And the point I'm making is, I mentioned the 2 languages. It's not limited to 2 languages. We fully recognise that we have an international community here in Wales, that we have people who come here to live, to work, to study, and we all belong to this one community. Which is, again, one of the reasons that we had the magazine. I I feel when people talk about like the queer community in the UK, it's often very London-centric, and if not London-centric, very England-centric in that sense. And this was an opportunity for us to provide a national identity for who we are, what we do, and to celebrate us as well. Because so often when you talk about LGBTQ plus people or LGBTQ plus issues and topics, it's through the lens of cisgendered, white, straight individuals, and very often men as well. So it's almost like our queerness and our authenticity is watered down or made more palatable for other people to be able to buy into and enjoy. But in fact, all of this is about providing our identity as it is. It's for the community, it's by the community, it's in our own words, and it's on our own terms, you know? And I think that's something really special, because going through editing the content and seeing what it looks like and seeing the stories that we've got, and also what we've got coming up for issue 2, because that's already been planned, I cannot begin to tell you just how much I have learned, and just how words fail me sometimes, language fails us sometimes. And it's not that it is that I can't think of the words, because I can't put it into words. It makes me feel so, I'll use the word proud of the community we have here in Wales, the communities we have here in Wales, actually. You know, we're all part of this one community, but, you know, recognizing that there are different communities within that, but we all belong, we all work together, you know, towards better. It's phenomenal. The stories, the experiences, the advice that you will get in this magazine, not because of the, you know, the magazine facilitates it, but because of these amazing people all across Wales. And I mentioned it very briefly earlier, this idea of celebrating them, because this magazine really does provide an opportunity for us to celebrate ourselves. Too often when we hear about LGBTQ plus issues or topics or people, as I've said, you know, the narrative is usually held by people or controlled by people who are not queer. But it's often in relation to something negative or something bad that's happened to us. And I just think about the impact that that has on, you know, young LGBTQ plus people, you know, adult LGBTQ plus people, that all we ever hear is that something bad is happening to us. And, you know, it's not to ignore that those things happen, because we do pay attention to those as well. But I think it's equally important to celebrate who we are, to celebrate that we have, you know, happy, successful, healthy LGBTQ plus people working, living, thriving in this world, despite all odds, and balancing that with the need to continue to fight on. You know, we've heard from a number of different people today about a number of different issues in regards to a number of different topics. When we spoke about, you know, boxing, and the conversation came up around how there's a narrative now around trans and non-binary individuals challenging whether they can be involved in sports in a number of different ways. And, you know, we hear those, but we never get to see. It's about moving together as a community and providing that platform to stand together against that. Is the point I'm trying to make there. And I think I went off tangent there, if I'm entirely honest, because I'm pulling myself back. But that's essentially what it's about. It's about supporting, celebrating, and connecting the LGBTQ plus communities of Wales, Welsh, Wales-based, across the world, showing them who we are, celebrating who we are, and paying attention to the fact that we together will work towards better for the community, by the community, in our own words and on our own terms, without the need to water down who we are or to make ourselves more palatable. And you can subscribe by going to LGBTQYMRU.Wales, and it'll be sitting in your inbox tomorrow morning, so you can have it with a cup of tea or whatever it is you like to enjoy for breakfast. But I'm very conscious now that I've said maybe more times than I've made sense. Again, so thank you. The chat's open, so I welcome any questions you have regarding the magazine. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. it is quite, I'm just posting some of the links that I promised in the chat and trying to do some multitasking. And yes, I had a little planted question because I know what these are. So I wanted to just to talk very briefly about the little strands that you have going through the magazine.
So life, community, culture, and health and well-being. Yeah, of course. So when we were having the initial discussions around what should be featured in the magazine, we wanted to make sure that we had an overall theme that guides our vision for each issue. And that then can be interpreted to a number of different sub-themes then, so like life, community, culture, health and well-being. And we have 4 community editors, 4 wonderful community editors who support our community reporters. And it provides us an opportunity to look at LGBTQ plus life in a number of different ways. So for example, in this issue, we talk about in health and well-being, we have our resident psychotherapist, Andy Garland, where you can submit questions and get responses from them. So kind of like an agony Andy, kind of. In life, we have a regular feature as well around LGBTQ plus and faith. So this time, in this edition, you can find it regarding Hidayah, which is a phenomenal group that supports LGBTQ plus Muslims. In culture, I really like culture, actually. Culture is probably my favorite. In that, you know, queer people are just so phenomenal when it comes to the arts, you know, and everything around culture, you know, poetry, literature, dance, performing arts, film, TV, was so wonderful. And I don't know, you know, there's many suggestions I can make as to why that is, but it's an opportunity for us to support and celebrate the LGBTQ plus people and our contributions to culture there. So for example, this time, we made contact with Nathan Wyburn, who actually created our front cover, which is phenomenal. And then community centers more around the kind of community aspects of what goes on, and to provide people with that information around community figures. Sorry, bit of dust in my throat. And all things pertaining to that.
Excellent, yeah. I've tried it. I posted the link there. You can also download the Zoom chat before you log out, and that will contain some of the key links and different addresses of people. It's been quite the undertaking, I think, you rounding up all the volunteers and their students in journalism and photojournalism and artists and Bangor's future mayor.
Yeah. Oh, so do you know what? And I've got to be
amazing. They are.
And I've got to be entirely honest, our community reporters, I couldn't have done this by myself. I really couldn't have. So, you know, thank you to Tanya, thank you to everyone involved. This is not a one-person thing. No. I quite begrudge saying that I'm like the founder or the chair, because it's such a collective effort. It's certainly not the efforts of just one person or just a few people. It's everyone involved.
Yeah. The ability of it. And also, you know, I wanted to encourage everyone, because I know the chat's been open and closed. I wanted to just to start rounding up and keeping the LGBTQYMRU magazine in mind. But I wanted to ask people who are joining us, you know, if you have any questions, you know, it's not questions, any areas that you think would be really useful to explore further. I mean, this is something. This was kind of started with the USW, but also thinking a bit more nationally, internationally. And if you think there's any future directions for research, I can also call in the panelists. They can also turn on their cameras and they can join us. But this is kind of a wider question about, you know, what are we doing? Well, firstly, I'm thinking about the university and as a platform for developing knowledge and also challenging some of the notions around knowledge, but also in terms of how the communities can get involved in this change and contributing towards visibility. So if you have any any ideas as to what we need to be focusing on or reflections on that, feel free to email email us or get in touch with us through social media. I'm sure everyone will you can email the Eventbrite email. You can get in touch with me through that, and I can also point you in the direction of the different speakers. So if there aren't any questions, I also want to thank Nick Miles, who's been our stage manager, behind the scenes, tech, promotion, corporate, everything. He's been supporting that, and thanking all the speakers today, and a little co-host, Bleddyn. We've done that, we've done this for the first time. So if you have any impressions of the event, and please also pop them down in the chat, because it's always helpful for us to see how this type of event is impacting or not impacting, or things that we can improve. So don't be afraid to pop that into the chat. So if there aren't any questions or comments, we would like to really thank everyone for listening in, for being an active part of this event, for showing interest and showing up. And thanks to Levin Harris also for hosting us, and also to Spectrum. I wanted to give a little shout out to that LGBT plus staff network, because they're amazing people that have been incredible. Well, for me personally, because they've helped me become part of a community within the university, and also they've also helped support these kinds of events all the time. So a big shout out to them, and to people who really supported this event and helping it, have been making it happen. So we'll pop in. Yes, thank you so much, and thanks to Sarah and to Stuart and to Gareth and to Ruth for there they go, for being a part of this. Right. Thanks very much. Wish we had a little music to end. We'll do a little ending gesture. But thanks so much.
Thank you both for being such amazing hosts. Really enjoyed it.
I mean, you were all fabulous. We were better, but I'm just... No, thank you all so much. Actually, I've been so insightful, actually. These are some of the things that I probably never would have considered. Hearing them, particularly with my LGBTQYMRU magazine hat on, the thought of this, exploring these in more detail and sharing them with a wider audience as well. Yeah. Love that.
Yeah.
So thank you all.
Someday we'll have like a whole weekend conference or a symposium, or I don't know. There's so much possibility in there. Oh, thanks, Ray. Really lovely that Ray was Ray Vincent has been Spectrum extraordinaire, trying to help the LGBT staff network. He's a chaplain, an amazing figure. Great to have you here. Thank you. Wonderful. Stop the recording now.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.